The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection with Al Page.
Our guest is Professor Noam Chomsky from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a guest lecturer at the University of Washington.
What determines how language in a particular country evolves? Why is French, for example, so different from German?
Well, first of all, you're assuming the French is different from German, and
the French would probably say so.
You know, there's no simple measure of how different languages are from one another. In fact, if you look at the languages structurally, the way a linguist would look at them, French is different from the other Romance languages in a variety of ways, which make it more similar to German and other Germanic languages. There are a number of features of French which are sort of Germanic in character.
Give us some of those features.
Well, just to take a simple one, in all the Romance languages, except for French, you can delete the subject of a sentence. You can say the equivalent of walks to the store, meaning he walks to the store. We can't do that in English, but you can do it in Italian or Spanish, and in fact it's common Romance, goes right back to Latin. French is the only Romance language in which you can't do that. It's like a Germanic language pretty much in that respect. They have what they call clitics, small pronouns that you attach to verbs. So you say the equivalent of I, him, saw. That's common Romance. But in the other Romance languages, you can do things like I, him, want to see. You can do that in all, meaning I want to see him, but not in French. And for a variety of constructions, actually, there are quite a number of respects in which French is different from the other Romance languages. Incidentally, Old French, Middle French, say French in the medieval period was not. It was like the other Romance languages. So something happened to it that made it less like the Romance languages and more like the Germanic languages.
How does language change over time? How did 18th century French change compared to 12th century French?
Well, you know, when we talk about language change, that's very misleading. I mean, there is no such thing as a language in French. I mean, up until, say, the turn of the century, you could find people in nearby villages in France who virtually could not understand one another. The idea of a national language is a pretty modern phenomenon. It has to do with the rise of nationalism and communication and so on, or take, say, Italy today, or Germany today. I mean, the differences among the things that we call German are enormous, so enormous as to lead to non-mutual intelligibility. You have to learn the national language when you go to school. It's a different language than the one you spoke at home. When we talk about language changing, what's actually happening is that it's kind of like species changing. There's a mixture of all sorts of dialects, and the mix changes over time, either because of conquest or some political change, or boundaries are drawn in a different place, or some kind of commercial interchange or whatever. The mixture of these things changes over time, and you take a look at it a few centuries apart, it looks like there's a different language. But what happens is that between generations, there are usually small changes having to do with other influences from the outside and so on. And these things are cumulative. Sometimes they lead to pretty dramatic changes. I mean, within a couple of generations, a language can change structurally in quite dramatic ways. And of course, in, say, lexicon, the words of the language, well, that's a different matter altogether. So when technology develops, you get a whole new vocabulary.
But if you were in France in the 12th century and you understood all the nuances of language, could you have predicted how these various languages would have evolved over time?
No, it's totally impossible. I mean,
is it partially random?
It's not so much that it's random. It's not actually random. For all we know, it might be completely deterministic. There's just too many factors involved. It's like predicting the weather. There's just too many things going on. Human life is a pretty complicated affair, and now our cultures are speakers of English can be misled by this. English is relatively homogeneous. You can go a long way in the United States. I just came from Boston, and I understand everybody in Portland and Seattle and so on. But that's not true of most of the world. Most of the world, language areas, that you can get very different languages pretty close by. And much of the world is what we would call multilingual.
The closer I get to the border between France and Germany, the closer the languages become.
Yeah, well, in particular, if you go from, say, Paris to Rome, as you go toward the Italian border, it starts to sound more like Italian, and at some point it becomes Italian. And there isn't, in fact, I mean, by now there's enough national unity and so on, so you can really find a border. But if you go back a little ways, there was no border. There was just I wouldn't say a continuum, there's just constant changes and fluctuations and variations. And you started speaking one thing in one place and another thing in another place, and they're not mutually intelligible often. But along the way, there are just all sorts of changes. Now, with the rise of national states, and especially national communications and national education systems and all of these things, which is a pretty modern phenomenon, then you get what we call national languages. Now, as I say, English is unusual. The reason, after all, you go to pre-colonial times, there were just hundreds of thousands, probably, of different languages spoken in what's now called the United States. Well, through the destruction of the indigenous population, and it was real destruction, kind of genocidal, and the conquest by speakers of basically one group, you ended up having a large homogeneous language. But how could anybody have predicted that? I mean, it had to do with the invention of guns and,
whole series
political
of things.
Conquest and all sorts of things. And that's pretty much what human history is.
There are some French theorists, for example, who argue that they must work very hard to keep the French language pure. What does that mean?
It doesn't mean anything. I mean, there's an old, virtually every national language, every national culture, or at least the European ones, maybe others, has a mythology that's the only real pure language, and all the others are corrupt. In France, this position is kind of extreme. In fact, if you go back to its origins, it's even a little bit comical. I don't know if anybody's actually studied it, but if you go back to, say, the 18th century and you read, say, Diderot, he explains, Diderot, very seriously, that he says, here's a prediction for you. He says, France is going to be the language of science, and German and English will be the languages of literature. And the reason for this is that French is very clear. In France, the words follow the order of the thoughts, whereas if you listen to German and English, the words don't quite follow the words of the thought. So French is good for telling the truth because of its, what later came to be called its Gallic lucidity and clarity, whereas German and I think his examples were German and English, maybe Italian. They're good languages for telling fantasies and falsehoods, so they'll be the languages of literature. Now, you can, it's a sort of naive point of view, but you can see what was going on in his head. I mean, for him, the words in French followed the order of thoughts. When you hear German, it seems all confused. I mean, they're thinking in some other way. Speaker of German looks the opposite, of course. And I suspect that the mythology of the purity and lucidity and clarity of French goes back to ideas of that kind. After all, French culture had a certain dominance and appeal for a long time, so these attitudes get established. But what does it mean for the language to be pure? Or when people say they want English to be pure, what are they talking about? Was Shakespeare pure? I mean, in fact, every stage of history, languages are, first of all, there is no such thing as a language. There are just lots of different ways of speaking that different people have, which are more or less similar to one another. And some of them may have prestige associated with them. For example, some of them may be the speech of a conquering group or a wealthy group or a priestly caste or one thing or another. And we may decide, okay, those are the good ones and some other one is the bad one. But if social and political relations reversed, we'd make the opposite conclusions. Let's say take Black English today. Black English is considered not quite proper English. On the other hand, if blacks happen to have all the power and own all the corporations and whites were working for them, it would be the other way around. Okay, Black English would be the language of culture and science and so on, and the stuff that you and I speak would be considered a degenerate dialect, which you have to get people out of so that they'll be able to think.
But that raises an interesting question. Why does language have rules? Why were we taught these rules in grade school? Why is bad grammar bad grammar?
Well, when you're taught rules of your own language in grade school, the chances are very strong that what you're being taught is false. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to be taught it.
But I can see every grade school teacher about to throw an orange at you on the screen.
There's, unfortunately, I mean, well, let me be a little more nuanced. One of the things you learn in grade school is the literary language. Now, in English, the literary standard is not so radically different from what, say, you and I grew up with, but it's somewhat different. The literary standard is not what I learned in the streets. It's not very different, but it's a little different. And when I went to school, I was taught the literary standard. Now, the literary standard has some principles associated with it, some of which are those of a real language, some of which are completely artificial. They were made up by people who had crazy ideas about language.
And they were all given names you never heard of before.
Yeah, and in fact, the reason you have to teach them is because they are not the person's language. Your actual language, nobody teaches you. I mean, your language just grows in your head. You know, you stick a child a young child in an environment where people are speaking language, and that child can no more help knowing that language than the child can help growing. It's just part of